the second generation children, like you are so much more fortunate than your parents, so you need to take that first step.
Hello and welcome to Holding Heritage. This is a space to explore and have honest conversations around the Asian North American experience. We'll focus on Canadian refugee stories, family, heritage, and bridging generational gaps. My name is Holly. Thank you so much for joining me. Hello and welcome to our very first Building Heritage episode. Building Heritage episodes are focused on topics through a more present lens, discussing and sharing how we are learning, building, and upholding our heritage today. In this episode, I'm very excited to introduce you to Nina. Nina and I connected shortly after I launched the podcast, and I'm incredibly grateful to have met her and be able to learn from her and talk about many of our shared passions and thoughts. It turned out that we are the same age, and although growing up in completely different countries and environments, we found that we went through a lot of the exact same types of experiences and thought processes growing up, all of which has led us to very similar mindsets today. If you're ready and in the mood for a deep diving conversation, keep listening because Nina and I explore a lot of our thoughts around cultural identity, cultural preservation, intergenerational connection, and she lets us into some of her fascinating thoughts around heritage language maintenance. Also, be sure to head to holdingheritage.com and check out the episode show notes for more context and information about Nina. So before we hop into the conversation, let me give you some quick context on just how amazing Nina is. Her name is Thao Nguyen, but she goes by Nina, which is what her family has called her ever since she was young. She's currently the communication coordinator for Montreal's Concordia University's TESL Resource Center, which is teaching English as a second language. She's also a master's student in applied linguistics at the university as well. She was born and raised in Saigon, Vietnam until she was 15, when she received a scholarship to study A-level in Cambridge in the UK. She completed her bachelor's degree at the University of Birmingham in business management and communications and started working for the fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar. After moving to Canada to be with her husband, she decided to try out a more proactive role as an English teacher and eventually found herself back in academia. Now she's focusing on heritage, language, maintenance, and critical pedagogy. In her free time, she manages the Instagram account at kona.yourvietnameseauntie, which aims at sharing her personal studying and living abroad knowledge and experiences to young Vietnamese women stepping out of their families for the first time. How amazing is she? So, without further ado, let's dive right into the conversation. Where in Vietnam are you from?
So I was born in Saigon, which is now known as Ho Chi Minh City.
Right.
But I feel like just the name Saigon resonates with me a lot more.
When you were born, was it already changed to Ho Chi Minh City?
Yeah, I think it's changed directly after, well, not directly, but the name got changed not long after the fall of Saigon.
Why does Saigon resonate with you more?
I think it's also because my family, they were more with the south of Vietnam. And, you know, like during the war and everything, even though they were not participating in anything political related, I feel like they more for south than north. Yeah. Growing up, I've listened to, you know, stories of my family, how they were thinking of leaving.
Yeah.
And my parents' families, both sides, they wanted to leave Vietnam after the war, a bit like your family. But I know the circumstances were different. But aim was the same, to leave a country that's no longer free.
Yes.
You know? But they couldn't. My oldest aunt and two uncles actually tried to flee the country, but they got caught 3 times, so they realized that maybe it's not meant to be.
Wow.
And yeah, so it's also a story of, you know, like a family who couldn't leave, who got caught and who had to stay back.
Yeah.
And then I also heard of stories of a relative family who the whole family, 6 people, died at seas, and they received
Wow.
nothing, like no response after that, and they just assumed the worst. So yeah, so I feel like that's why, like, the family and me specifically, we resonate with the name Saigon, the city that's before the fall of Saigon, right?
Right. So what was the motivation for your family members wanting to leave? You guys are Vietnamese, right? You're like your
Yeah,
family.
yeah,
Yeah.
we Vietnamese. I think I told you that we from Hue. Do you know the
Right.
city? Did you?
I don't know much about it. No.
Okay, so the city itself is in central Vietnam. So we have Hanoi, which is the north,
Yes.
and then we have Saigon, which is like from the south, and then Hue is like in the middle.
Mm,
It used to be the capital of Vietnam.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and the royal family lives there.
Okay. If you were to say, like, is it in North Vietnam or is it in South Vietnam or is it really like smack right in the middle?
Okay, so politically speaking, it will be considered south of Vietnam
Okay.
because I think when they divided the country, it
Hmm.
was really below the north. So it was more like in the south.
Right.
But geographically speaking, it's right in the middle.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's considered a part of central Vietnam. But politically speaking, with the division and everything, then it's more like the south.
Mm,
Yeah, so the royal family used to live there. Like if you go and visit Hue today, you could visit like the Forbidden City and everything. Like, yeah.
yeah.
So
Cool.
that's where my family's from.
Hmm.
My mom and her siblings grew up in that kind of like southern Vietnam political scene,
Right.
and also that's why they are more pro South. When there was the war, and after that, the fall of Saigon, my granddad, before the war, he was a principal of a school in Hue.
Wow.
And after the war, obviously, they assigned another person to be the principal, right? And, he couldn't work what he wanted to anymore,
Hmm. Yeah.
and life was different from before. And yeah, so it was really sad because when the war happened, so like when the army from the north came to Hue, they
Hmm.
abandoned their house to go and live in the countryside for a few months
To get away from the
to get
government.
away from the
Right.
bombing and everything. And
Yeah.
when we got back to the house in the city, it was confiscated by the army. And it is still now like a building of committee. Like, so like,
Really?
like when we get back to her, like my mom always like, that used to be my house.
That's crazy. Have you been back? Have you seen it
I
yourself?
have been back. I've seen it myself. It's
Was
hard
that the house
to.
that you grew up in, or that was
No, no, I
right?
grew up in Saigon, so that's
Right.
the
Okay.
story in the wall.
Hmm.
And it's just very funny because like it sounds like a story that's not true, but then my mom showed me all of these photos they had when they were kids, and
Yeah.
it's the same staircase, it's the
Wow.
same yard, it's the same house. Yeah, so because the house got confiscated, the whole family, so my granddad, my grandmom, and 6 children moved to the countryside. He couldn't work as a principal anymore. Life was hard. My mom said that there wasn't enough food for them. And my grandma, she's from a wealthy family.
Hmm.
And so it was unbearable for her to start farming and
Right. Such a huge
raising.
contrast.
Yeah, yeah. So they were thinking of leaving. But at that time, my mom was 8, and I told you that there were 6 children, right?
Yeah.
So
So
my mom,
those would be your mom and her siblings.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That would be my mom and her siblings. So I have the oldest aunt, and then 2 uncles, and then my mom, and then 2 young aunties.
Mm.
And my mom and the 2 young aunties were too young to leave. She was 8, and one aunt was 7, and one aunt was 6.
Hmm.
So the family thought of dividing into 2 groups. So the parents will stay with the 3 kids, like the 3 young kids,
Right.
and the 3 older kids will find a way to leave. but obviously they couldn't. They tried 3 times, and every time they got caught by the police. But they were below 18 or something, so
Hmm.
they dodge prison, and
Oh,
yeah, they stay in the camp for like a few days, and they're like, okay, you guys kids, you can go home to your parents.
wow,
Um,
that's lucky.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
after that, my granddad was like, okay, so maybe we're not meant to be separated. We can just, like live here. And eventually, the whole family moved to Saigon, where it is a little bit more, like I think it's more like a land of immigrants. So everyone's there to seek economic benefits. And
Right.
it's a little bit like the American dream. Where everything is possible.
Yeah. The Vietnamese dream.
The Vietnamese dream. Yeah. So my family, my granddad, my grandma, my mom, and their siblings moved down to Saigon, to the south, and they lived there. And then my mom got married, and then I was born in Saigon. Yeah, yeah. But like the story, I've never witnessed any of that, like any of the famine, any of the struggle that they've been through. But I've heard enough to feel, and
Yeah.
I could imagine them being starved, and how desperate my granddad felt when he couldn't be the principal that he was anymore.
Right. Yeah.
And I could
Wow.
imagine like how shocked my grandma felt when after a week or 3 weeks, like her old life disappeared, and now she had to, like go to the farm and started farming. And
Yeah.
I mean, like farming is a beautiful job, but for someone who has not done it before, and someone who's, doing farming to feed 6 children, it's, yeah,
And I'm sure the circumstances of, getting their house taken away. Yeah, I can't imagine
yeah,
that life. A lot of the stories that my family tells me, when you're young, well, I don't know, maybe it was different for you because you grew up there, but me growing up here, when my parents would tell me stuff, I'd be like,
that's not true.
that's not real. Yeah, what do you mean you never had milk, or
Hmm.
never had enough food and stuff? And
Yeah.
it's only now, that I'm older, that I can really, I guess, like, process
Hmm.
what actually they
Yeah.
went through, which is incredible.
And that's why I really admire what you're doing, to explore your heritage, and
Oh,
to go back and, to talk to your parents. And, it's not just kids in developed countries. I mean, like second generation children in developed countries that experiences assimilation. Even in Vietnam, I was sent to, so life got better. My mom got married, and my dad was like this very, future thinking person.
mhm.
And he decided to talk to my mom to send me to an international school.
Oh, so an international school in Vietnam.
Exactly. So
Okay.
it's not abroad yet.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So I was sent to an international school in Vietnam. All the teachers were white.
Was
It's
that in Saigon?
It's in
Yeah.
Saigon. It's called Australian International School Saigon. If you
Oh.
Google, it still exists.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they sent me there. The teachers were all mostly Australian. Some are
Mhm.
British. Some were American.
Was that all of your schooling from kindergarten
It
up?
was really just secondary. So I went through primary school in public school in Vietnam,
Yeah.
and I think my mom wasn't very happy with the way public schools in Vietnam was operating. I remember when I was in grade one, she found a lot of things that she was unhappy with the textbooks, and she was like, this is not how you teach Vietnamese. And especially when they started teaching history, like
Mhm.
my family were like, this is not the real history, this is written by the winner, you don't consider the loser side, and this is not critical and whatsoever. And like I mentioned, my dad was a very future thinking person, and he
Yeah.
was like, okay, like this is not working, we don't want our daughter to have none of this like critical thinking. So
Yeah.
that's why he thought that maybe we're going to send her to an international school so she could be submerged in this English speaking environment. She will study world history, and everything would be in English, and with, like all the things about heritage or histories, then I learn from my mom's stories and my dad's
Yeah.
stories of their family. So I mean, I consider myself lucky in that sense. But then when I was in international school, I experienced the same thing that you were talking about in episode 2. I wanted to be like my teachers. I wanted to be
Wow.
rude,
So,
like
so were all of your classmates, they were also Vietnamese kids?
uh, I would say 30 to 40% Vietnamese, and then the rest were from all over the world, mostly children of diplomats, for example.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit like neo-colonial, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So what was going through your mind at that time? Like you had gone to primary school in Vietnam, and then once you were thrown into this kind of like white dominated
Yeah,
environment.
it's funny because, like now I'm talking about critical pedagogy and that we have to be aware of this.
Critical pedagogy is a philosophical teaching that calls educators to encourage their students to critique structures of power and oppression. In critical pedagogy, teachers often use their own insights and self awareness to encourage their students to question and challenge inequalities that exist within families, schools, and societies.
Like as teachers, especially like white teachers teaching in developing countries, you need to be aware of how much you impact teenagers or students. But back in the days, like we were talking like 15 years ago,
Yeah,
it was before the time when everyone was woke. So,
exactly, exactly.
so like critical pedagogy was like non-existent back in the day. um, so yeah, I felt like there was this identity crisis. I don't belong in my parents' world, but I don't belong in my teacher's world at the same time.
Yeah.
It's just I feel like I'm just floating in between, and exactly what you were saying in episode 2. Like I wanted to be white because I feel like wow, everything is working out for them. They living in Vietnam, but they never really have to learn Vietnamese. When you are a white person and you are working in a developing country, you don't even have to learn their language or learn
Yeah.
their customs or what's
Very little struggle because people
exactly,
are also they look up at you almost like you're on a pedestal or you're like some
exactly,
god.
exactly,
Yeah.
and like the association is strong. Like you look at your teacher from the UK or from the US or from Australia, you're thinking that oh my gosh, they belong to the high society, like the elite world,
Right.
and everything seems to work out for them. The staff at the school has to learn their language to speak to them. So
Oh,
I
yeah.
feel like, man, I want to be like them. So there's this kind of power that they were exuding, that
And it's like unintentionally.
yeah.
I felt the same way too of, having white friends growing up.
Mhm.
It was even down to the language. Like, I had friends being like, "You're not even Asian. You're
But that's so
so."
sad.
Yeah, and now that I look back on it, my feeling of when they would say that to me, I'd be like, "Yes."
Yeah, I
Like,
made
that's
it,
amazing.
like
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I made it, exactly. I made it, I'm the same as them, they see me
yeah.
as the same, and it's interesting because especially when I think back on it now, I don't think that I was on the same level that I thought I was because they
Mhm,
would still say things that would clearly make us kind of, like, othered, right? Like, we are
mhm. Yeah, like
Asian.
we versus they.
Yeah, and that's so interesting to hear that for you even growing up
In
in Vietnam, you experienced the same thing, and that makes so much sense. It really
the
does.
same complete thing, and it's sad when I think about my days. I mean, like it was fun at the school.
Of
Like
course, yeah.
I mean, like there's definitely pluses, like I met international friends, I
Yeah.
met so many people there, I got to know different cultures, I got exposed to world history. So I mean, it's great. The learning experiences were great.
Yeah.
But in terms of identity crisis is
Yeah.
really there. Like children in international school, they would avoid using chopsticks, for example. They will pretend not to know how to use chopsticks. Or intentionally try not to understand Vietnamese, or intentionally speak a lot of English in their Vietnamese speech. I don't know.
Yeah.
All of these things
Wow.
just kind of show that there's this kind of rejecting culture, because they're
Yeah.
looking up to, like I said, 15 years ago. I mean, even nowadays, not many people are aware of what they're doing. Not many white people or Western teachers in developing countries
Yeah.
are aware of what they are doing, right?
Yeah.
Like when they look down on the locals' food, for example, they set
Mm-hmm.
up such a strong example for the students to do the same thing, even though it is their cultural food. They
Yeah.
would
Oh my
not,
goodness.
yeah, they would
That's
not
so
want
true.
to eat the food anymore because their teachers think that it's not cool, you know?
They hold so much power in a position like
Yeah.
that. Since Nina's family wasn't able to send her abroad to study right away, they were content with this happy medium of sending her to this international school. From that international school, she was able to achieve a lot academically, and as she got older, one thing led to another, and when she was only 15 years old, she accepted a scholarship to study in the UK.
And at that time, it was also the teenage phase. The I want to be free. I want to see the world. I want to see where my teachers are from. You know,
Yeah.
like what a world out there. And the fact that they got paid so much in Vietnam just because they are from abroad. I want to
Mm-hmm.
be. I don't know, like an international citizen to
Right.
get higher paid as well. Well, that was not true because now I'm working in Canada, but no one paid me better because I'm from.
Oh no.
But anyways, I was 14 at the time when, yeah, I was pretty young, but
So young, really
yeah.
young. I'm trying to think, like, what was I doing when I was 14?
Well, I feel like probably because I do speak the language, so I speak both Vietnamese and English. I'm very close to my family, so I listen to their stories. I know within myself, I feel like I gotta go. I gotta see what's out there. I gotta
Yeah.
see what is beyond this country.
Mhm.
So even though my life was great back then, like my life
Right.
was amazing. Like I got to live with my family. I went to one of the top schools, like international schools, like for the wealthy families. And
Yeah.
I contacted the school in the UK. I was like, "Hi, my name is whatsoever." Like I got to know this representative at the school fair in Vietnam,
Yeah.
and I'm very interested in your programs. And like I'm from abroad, and I was just wondering if there's any program to support international students to come and study at your school.
Yeah.
And I had to do like a test. I had to do a math test, a science test, I think, and an English test.
Mhm.
So I did all of that for many schools, not just one.
Right.
And finally, I got the answer from two schools, both
Mhm.
from the UK. And from two schools, I chose one. And then when I was 15, I went abroad. It's actually a scholarship that belongs to the school, so it's not like a third party scholarship.
Mhm.
So that helps a lot
Yeah.
because even my family, they couldn't afford to just send me abroad like that. And so with the scholarship, it actually helped my parents so much.
Yeah.
So I went abroad and I went to the UK,
You're
and
so young too,
I
at
was I was
15.
15.
Were
I
you
was
scared or
I
were
was
you
actually I
just
was so happy. Like I was like, now I can see the real world. Like I'm not stuck in this Disneyland of
right?
international school. And so I was so happy. I was like, oh my gosh, like I did it. I can
Yeah.
see the world. So I flew to the UK, and then I realized that I'm not an expat. Like I'm not an expat like my teachers were. I'm an immigrant. It's just, and I feel like it's the moment where I realize the power dynamic in Vietnam of English speaking teachers. Because when
Wow.
I went abroad, I was an international student. I didn't have any privilege. It was not because I'm from abroad that I was special. You know, they still see me as, you know, this communist girl. I don't know, like
It almost sounds like, you're in Vietnam and you're kind of living in this bubble,
it was.
and then you leave and you're all of a sudden like your bubble is popped and you're like, "Oh, wow." Like not that that wasn't real, but it's like there's so much more
Mhm.
that you weren't exposed to.
Exactly. Like, I don't know, racism, for example, discrimination.
Yeah.
I've heard all of this before, but I did not experience it in Vietnam. Um, it's
Yeah.
just really, you feel like they're looking down on you. You know, sometimes they say things that's a bit more passive aggressive,
Yeah.
and some jokes are not just jokes because there's always a bit of truth. You know,
Yes.
like people asking, like, "Oh, so you're coming here to steal jobs?" You know, like,
What? They would say that to you?
yeah, and
I
it's like,
Wow.
yeah, like that's what I was thinking. I was like, wow, like I don't receive the same treatment. Why?
Yeah.
So I don't know, like it's just a lot of things together that brings me to my life today. Yeah, I graduated in 2015.
Yeah. So was
So
that a high school that you graduated? Because you're 14, or did you go into like a college program?
so at 15 I went to a college.
Mm.
So it's called A level in the UK, and it's like the equivalent of like the 2 years before you go to university. And then after that, I went to do my bachelor
Hmm.
in the UK as well. And then, so in 2015, I graduated from university, and I was just like, you know, too young. My whole life was just studying, get things done, get the grade,
Right.
look for ways to elevate myself and get people treated me better. So I feel like I should go back to Vietnam at that time. So I went back to Vietnam after
Hmm.
graduating, and I landed a job at Harper's Bazaar. Do you know the magazine
No,
Harper's Bazaar?
no.
It's a fashion magazine.
In Vietnam.
No, it's an international fashion magazine. It's called
Oh.
Harper's Bazaar,
Hmm.
and but it's a Vietnamese edition. So
Gotcha.
being like bilingual English Vietnamese, I thought that
Yeah.
it was the perfect job. It was fun for a year, and then I met my husband, my current
Oh.
husband.
So he was from Montreal.
It was from
Yeah.
Montreal. Yeah, I moved to Montreal first on a visitor visa, just
Hmm.
to kind of see the world here,
Yeah.
and again, like just that story of expat versus immigrant. Yeah, I was on an 8 month visa. I wasn't sure if I was going to live in Montreal, but the
Right.
moment I stepped my foot into Canada, I am an immigrant. I've never been considered an expat, you know? And then you have like Western people living in Vietnam for years and years. They buy houses, they make families, and they still live in their little expat bubble that they can
Hmm.
choose whatever they want to. Yeah.
So is your family still in Vietnam?
Yes, so my family, my mom and maternal family, so my
Yeah.
granddad and my grandma and all the siblings,
Hmm.
I mean, my mom's siblings and
Yeah.
in Vietnam right now.
They must be so proud of you, like, very excited for you, because 'cause I'm sure they put in so much effort and love into sending you abroad and to see you so successful and happy.
I think it's a great way to put it because my uncle now is still, telling his two young kids about me as like a success case.
Wow.
But what I feel that is not good is that that power dynamic that I was telling you about,
Yeah.
Like from their perspective, say like from my uncle's perspective, it's because I learned English. English was the key to success. My parents handed me this key that I could open the door to success, but I don't like this metaphor. I feel like we put too much power into English for what? like
And just like the Western
world.
world in general, right? So many parents and families in Asia will just send their kid over.
Yeah, so I feel so grateful to have met you and to know that you're doing this kind of podcast. It set up an example, you know. It speaks volume to especially like kids in Vietnam, kids studying in international school, kids wanting to be white, you know. Like it
Yeah.
sets up an example that there's a kid grew up abroad in Canada who's learning about her heritage. That speaks a lot of
I just
volume.
want to cry.
Oh, no, but that's what I felt because for kids in Vietnam, they need this kind of people. They need an example to know where their identities lie, right?
Yeah.
Because
Wow.
otherwise they feel like I want to be like I want to be like Nina. She doesn't speak Vietnamese now. She lives in Canada. Or I want to be like, I don't know, Ashley Ainsley, who were born Vietnamese but now they she's like basically white, you know. Like I don't want that kind of example for
Absolutely.
the next generation. And that's why I felt like we need more people like you. Like we need more second generation who currently looking and learning their heritage language. And this is something cool to do. This is something right, not just cool but right to do. You
Yeah. First of all, I think that's so interesting because I I never thought about it in the way that you just expressed it, of people in Vietnam, like maybe kids, thinking and seeing that I'm so interested in learning about my heritage and how that
know?
could impact them. Like that makes me feel so emotional because I'm just exactly the opposite. You know, almost in my life, I want to be like, I just want to move to Vietnam, or I want to move to
Yeah,
China, and I want to like immerse myself in there and learn about it all. But to
yeah,
think that, you know, there are people on the other side that are wanting the exact same thing, you know? It's kind of
yeah,
like the grass is always greener on the other side.
exactly.
Like I now so my family speaks Cantonese and Vietnamese, but we're Chinese, so they mostly speak Cantonese.
Mhm,
And Cantonese was my first language when I was a kid, but growing up here, you know, I never wanted to speak Chinese, so I would speak English back to my parents. And now I'm learning more
mhm,
Cantonese and I can like kind of speak to my grandma. But growing up, it was always just the regular, like, do you want food? Are you hungry? No, thank
mhm,
you. Yes, please. And Vietnamese, like, I don't understand a lot at all.
mhm,
Um, and that was something for me that when I was older a few years ago, I felt so sad about it because I was like, that is something that I have lost and that
mhm,
it's going to take a lot of my time and effort, especially as an adult now. Like it's not as
mhm,
easy to learn.
mhm,
And talking to my cousins too about our parents now are the only ones who cook the traditional food.
mhm,
They're the ones who do the traditional ceremonies.
mhm.
And growing up, we were kind of just like,
What
why are
is
we,
this?
yeah, why are we doing this? Why are we eating this? And coming to the realization of, if I don't learn how to cook this, if I don't
Mhm,
learn why we do this,
mhm,
my kids are going to have no idea. And that scares me
mhm.
so much.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, that's
yeah, and
just
I mean, like, I think we all went through this identity crisis of floating in between, right?
yeah.
Like, we don't really know where we belong. Like, you just beautifully expressed it, like, in the way that, you know, like, you either you want to move to the East and just immerse yourself there, and then people
Yeah.
from the East wanting to go to the West, and, you know, kids especially just want to be like the white peers that I see on TV. I think we need, like, as second generation. Well, I'm not second generation, but I feel like I've talked to so much second
Yeah.
generation. I feel like there's need to be this kind of balance point of,
Yeah.
and I feel like culture is not just two bounded entities. You know, I feel like culture, any culture, exists on this continuum, you know, and one
Yeah.
side is east and one side is west, for example, and we kind of move along the slide, the scale, right?
Mhm.
if we living in Canada, we living in the West world, we cannot fit ourselves in that east bounded entity anymore, you know.
Yeah.
We just kind of have to move on the scale, and sometimes we move closer to one side, and
Hmm.
sometimes we move closer to the other side, and sometimes we just stay in between.
Our generation, like you're like 1.5 and I'm second generation, but we share so many commonalities in that, if we have kids, right, or our future family
Mhm,
generations, we're kind of in the driver's seat of building the foundations of what the
mhm,
heritage for our children and future
exactly.
generations will be. So,
Mhm,
and they're going to be, in charge of how or if that gets carried on.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think we're in a position where, exactly like you said, we can choose to kind of float to one side or the
Mhm,
other or incorporate both. And
mhm,
I tend to feel like a lot of my peers that are second gen are floating closer to just keeping the Western
mhm,
side, where it might become sort of like a regret when you're
mhm,
older,
mhm,
because culture preservation, I feel like, is something that once you lose it, you can't have it back.
mhm, yeah.
And yeah, so I totally agree with you. Like there has to be a sort of bridging
Mhm,
of the two. But the
yeah,
caveat of that is that, people have to want to do that.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I feel like the thing about wanting, the desire of doing something, is to see other people doing it, you know. So
Yeah, I hope so.
I
Yeah.
feel like to have these initiatives to talk about heritage, I mean, it's becoming more and more, um, um, not mainstream, but it's become more and more prominent these days.
Yes, absolutely, which is
It's great.
great. It's so
Yeah,
great to see.
yeah.
People are more comfortable with sharing their stories now.
Hmm.
With that already kind of issue of like, okay, how do I keep my heritage and how
Hmm.
do I want to keep my heritage? It's then
Yeah.
like, how do I, as a second generation, then reach out to my elder generations
Hmm.
that are not used to talking, that, they themselves have their own traumas of coming to a Western
Yeah.
world, not wanting to share, not wanting to pass on their things. Like, how do
Hmm.
we build that relationship and get those important stories and things like that so that we can pass it on?
Just, yeah, like I'm very happy that you're doing this for your family, for your mom, your dad, and generally for the heritage, right?
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Because since I've released the podcast too, I've had people be like, "Oh, you're so lucky that your parents are so open. You're so lucky that you have like the relationship with your parents that you have." And I am like, I'm so grateful. I feel like I just want to scream, "You can do this too," because like I am a perfect example of like I didn't want anything to do with my family, and like over just a few years, the amount of like healing and understanding, if
Hmm.
you want to, if you put in the effort, before it's too late, so to say, like
You
you
have
can
to
you
do
can
it.
do that. Yeah. And I think
The
that a lot of people, they'll kind of listen to stories, and this is me too. In the past, I would listen to things and I'd be like, oh, that's so great for them, but like I would never
not
be
gonna
able to
do
do
it.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like my parents would never be open, they would never say that. Or like,
Yeah.
I know I'm so privileged that my parents speak English. Um, but even when people are like, "Oh yeah, it's because they speak English to you that you can do that." I'm like, I've spoken to my grandma, like I've gotten a
Hmm.
translator or like something, like if you want to
You will
connect,
find a way.
yeah, you'll find a way and you
Yeah.
can.
I think it ties up to the fact that we have to be aware that the more privilege we are born with, the more responsibility we have to take
Yes.
on. And yeah, it goes the same with everything. Like the Western teachers who go into developing countries,
Yeah.
because you're so privileged, you need to be more responsible, you know,
Yeah.
for the second generation children, like you are so much more fortunate than your parents, so you need to take that first step. You
Yes.
have that responsibility, you know. The luckier you are, the more responsible you are, right?
I think that's a really tough pill to swallow, and I struggled with that too because the dynamic of, parent and child, you kind
Mm-hmm.
of feel like, or I spent a lot of time feeling like they're the parent. They
They should
should
do
reach
it.
out
Yeah.
for me. Yeah, they should want to do that. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, coming to the realization that you just said, like, we are so much more privileged
Mm-hmm.
than them. Yes, they're older. Yes, they're our parents. But if we are holding back from connecting because of our egos,
Mm-hmm.
it's different because they're holding back from connecting because of their trauma and their
Mm-hmm.
upbringing and their culture. Like, it's so much easier for us, and it would mean a lot more to them if
It
we're
matters
the
a lot
ones,
more.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Super complex, very
It's
intricate.
very complicated. It's basically what I wanted to explore with my MA thesis. Yeah, like
So what
so
what is you're doing linguistics, you said,
I'm
right?
doing applied linguistics,
Yeah.
yes. And yeah, so I'm conducting my thesis as basically the last piece of my whole master's. I've done
Mhm.
all the courses. Now it's just a thesis to be completed.
Congratulations. That's
Thank
very
you.
exciting.
Yeah, I really hope that I can complete my thesis. I can complete writing and everything by the end of this year. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, my thesis is on heritage language maintenance, and heritage language and heritage culture kind of, they go hand in hand, right?
Absolutely.
um, and the loss of language may result in the loss of the culture too. So my thesis is on examining the likelihood of Vietnamese parents passing down the language to second generation. I am examining first their perceived role of language in their cultural identity. It's such a
Mm,
mouthful to say, but basically each of us has a cultural identity, right?
yeah.
So like for you, it will be Vietnamese, Chinese Vietnamese. For my husband, that could be like Người Hoa, right?
Mhm.
Very similar concept.
Yeah.
For me, that would be Vietnamese. And in this cultural identity, we have different pieces in it. So you have the food, you have the festival,
Yeah.
you have the language, you have the religion, right? And I am examining not the whole thing, but just the language component of the cultural identity. And my hypothesis is that the more central the language piece is,
Mhm.
the more likely, obviously, the parent will pass down the language to the children.
Right.
Because obviously, for some people, they think that you have to speak Vietnamese to be a Vietnamese, right? Some other people will say that you have to know the history of Vietnam to be
Right.
Vietnamese. So it's not quite the same. But this component, right, of language in the cultural
Mhm.
identity is influenced by many other factors. For example, political trauma,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
War trauma, generational trauma. German immigrants who experienced Holocaust will not pass down the well, not will not, but
Yeah. Are
they
likely not
are likely
to.
not to
Yeah.
do that because it's trauma. Like even though language is a big part, it's more like a rejected part now.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I feel like it's so interesting to talk to first generation parents to see what they feel, what is going on, and
Yeah.
why certain parents decide to pass down the language and some will not.
Yeah.
And it's really sad. Like I am now a teaching assistant at the university, so I
Mhm.
grade students and I also teach some of the lectures.
Yeah.
And I'm really into recognizing variation in languages
Yeah.
because a loss of a language most of the time, not all the time, but it could result in the loss of a culture too.
Absolutely.
Like I keep telling my students that Quebecer French is not wrong. It's not bad. It's just another variety.
Yes. Oh, that is such a huge stereotype.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, stop saying that, oh, I don't want to speak Quebec French because it's full of English slang and bad pronunciations.
Hmm.
Like, just imagine how immigrants in Quebec feel, They
Yeah.
didn't have a choice. They were not privileged like you to learn proper French, whatever that is that you called.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, I don't want to have English teachers or language teachers in the future going into developing countries or even teaching locally to contribute to this kind of social injustice. It's really sad. Like, I remember when I started learning French here in
Hmm.
Quebec, and I got this French teacher from France, and the first day she was like, "I'm not going to teach you Quebec French or French here because it's not the true French," and
Wow.
I was like, "Yeah, but you in Quebec, like."
Right.
I don't know, like, even though I don't speak French a lot, like, I learned enough to kind of navigate my
Hmm.
way. Like, I really should like brush up my French, but it's hard, like you said, to learn another language when you're older.
Yeah.
Not because of your brain, but because you have so many other things to take care.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just feel like this is not the way that teachers should go about and do things. Just imagine, like, I don't know, you teach in Singapore and you like Singlish is wrong, Singlish is bad.
Yeah.
It's their pride, it's
And I
yeah,
think there's so much power in those words too, like exactly like
yeah,
what we were talking about before. The power dynamic of like you are a
yeah,
teacher and you have a classroom of students that are
yeah,
hanging on every word that you say,
yeah,
whether or not they really recognize how much it's impacting
yeah,
them, your one little sentence of like it's
yeah.
not real French
Yeah.
could just ripple throughout so much
Gosh, that's so
of
true.
their
And it's the
thoughts,
same
right?
thing when they hear a person from a bigger country or a bigger place that they associate with, like higher society, saying that your
Yeah.
language is wrong.
Yeah.
It's sad and
And I think that's something that's, probably not thought of,
mhm,
because it's just so normal. And I feel like even in English, talking about different accents
yeah,
and it comes with a lot of like different connotations and
yeah,
stereotypes as well, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, when you talk about a language, like when you comment on a language, you kind of indirectly comment on the speaker of that
Yes.
language,
Yeah.
right? And it
Yeah.
impacts them, it impacts the next generation, like how the dad didn't want to teach his children, the heritage language.
Yeah. And I think that I mean, it kind of going off topic, but I feel like that core messaging can be
Mhm.
seen in so many different aspects of culture in general, like food. And my mom would spend so long making such a nice hot lunch for me. And I bring it to school and I'd open it up, and like one person's like, "Oh my God, what is that? It smells so weird." Or like, "What are you eating?" Right? It's so sad. And then that kind of like carries on to, me as a kid being like, "Oh,
Mhm.
I'm not gonna bring that to school. I'm not gonna
Mhm.
eat that anymore. I'm not gonna, like, no, don't make me that. I don't like that."
Mhm.
Which is, it's so sad. And now growing up, I'm kind of like, wow, that was just so heartbreaking.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I feel like, the culture is all, like I said, like the culture identity entails so many things.
Yeah, it really
And
does.
I feel like language, well, for me, I know it's different from different people for different people, but
Mhm.
language is like the main thing that holds everything together.
Yeah.
History, religion, food, connection with your family,
Yes.
all of these things, you need language to facilitate, right?
Yes, I agree. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed the chat that Nina and I had today and that maybe it gives you some food for thought. I feel super grateful and lucky to be able to connect with Nina and feel so comfortable doing so. She's got so much valuable insight, and I can't wait to continue learning from her and keep up with all of the amazing things she's pursuing. Remember to check out and follow her Instagram account at kona.yourvietnameseauntie. That is at kona.yourvietnameseauntie, where she's sharing some amazing content on her personal studying and living abroad knowledge and experiences aimed towards young Vietnamese women stepping out of their families for the first time. She's also a published author and wrote a book in Vietnamese about her 5-year journey in the UK. So head to holdingheritage.com, visit the episode show notes, and take a look for more information, photos, and awesome context. Also, send me a message to let me know your thoughts on this episode because I would love to connect with you. And thank you again for listening. I will meet you back here again very, very soon. Bye! Music by Blue Wednesday. Be sure to check him out. He's amazing. And as always, Holding Heritage is created, produced, and geographically based on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh and Comox nations of the Coast Salish peoples.